Then some men came down from Judea and taught the brothers, "Unless you have yourselves circumcised in the tradition of Moses, you cannot be saved." The affirmation of a ritual, an indelible sign of a covenant between God and his people. A seal that sacred scripture traces back to Moses, and even further back to a man who lived 2,000 years before Christ, a man called Abraham. Millions of believers of different religions still turn to him as their common father in faith. Circumcision was often performed invoking his name. Its deep religious implications meant it was a practice Paul couldn't afford to ignore. A day like any other in Sanliurfa, Turkey, southeast Anatolia. Believers coming from all over the Middle East gather in front of a thick grate, which shields the spot where tradition claims Abraham was born. His name can be heard everywhere, among the religious buildings, on the banks of the lake filled with fish that are considered sacred, inside the school where a teacher dictates devotional doctrine. Abraham Khalil-Allah, friend of God, was circumcised at the age of 80. So reads a verse by the prophet Muhammad. Jerusalem, the Kotel, all that remains of the western wall of the temple of Herod the Great. Here too the memory of Abraham is alive. The prayers of the Jews, accompanied by regular rhythmic movements of the body, constantly recall the name of the man considered the father of the three great monotheistic religions. You shall circumcise your foreskin, and this shall be the sign of the covenant between myself and you. The words of God to Abraham in the first book of the Bible. A Friday at the end of summer in Isparta, Turkey, in the Tauri region. There's great excitement in the city. The name of Abraham is repeated in the chants and prayers that accompany a community ceremony. A circumcision ritual. Why perpetuate a practice whose origins go so far back in time? Why repeat a ritual still respected by the Jewish people that involves every male child 8 days after his birth? A sign of membership, perhaps? A hygienic practice? An initiation ritual involving virility in marriage? The consecration of procreative power? Abraham, friend of God for the Muslims, the chosen one for the covenant of God with the Jews, perpetuates his solemn agreement with God up until our own day, and he does so through this ritual.
The small caravan passed almost unnoticed through the gates of Antioch. Only the guards on the hill of Silpius, who registered every movement into or out of the city, notified the head of the garrison about the men who came down from Judea.
Paul and Barnabas were notified too. They heard what was being preached by these Judeo-Christians, these members of the Pharisees' party who had become believers, but who were still staunch upholders of the law of Moses. Others heard too and followed them. They did more than preach. They went around warning the brothers, "Unless you have yourselves circumcised, you cannot be saved." Paul and Barnabas had no choice but to argue against a notion that suggested the pagans were obliged to integrate themselves totally within Judaism through the radical expression of circumcision. The debate became heated. There seemed no way out of it. Paul, Barnabas, and Titus, a Greek who was not obliged to be circumcised, along with others of the church, decided to go to Jerusalem to consult the apostles and the elders.
The road they traveled was the one that follows the Mediterranean coastline from Antioch in Syria. The road crosses Phoenicia and Galilee before reaching Caesarea in Samaria and linking up with Jerusalem. Just over 500 kilometers to be covered on foot, of course. The journey provided an opportunity to meet various established communities. Probably they were Christians who belonged to Stephen's original group. Jews who called themselves Hellenists and who had found a safe haven and eager listeners here. Paul's words were of great encouragement. Words that stressed, according to Luke, how the pagans had been converted. This news was received with the greatest satisfaction by the brothers.
October the 11th, 1962. A procession of 2,500 white mitres makes its way towards St. Peter's Basilica for the opening of the Second Vatican Council.
The word council evokes powerful ecclesiastical images and associations, like these. A council, a solemn assembly that brings together thousands of delegates from all over the world, involving dozens of study commissions, attracting massive media attention with correspondents representing every corner of the globe. The assembly that gathered in Jerusalem around the year 49 AD was a lot simpler, although it has been described as the first council in history.
Some of the meetings may have been held in the homes of acquaintances on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Luke is forthcoming with details. They were welcomed by the church, he tells us, by the apostles and elders.
They gave an account of all that God had done with them. Luke introduces what promised to be a peaceful exchange of ideas. An account followed of the first days of evangelization, the stay in Cyprus, the Christian message proclaimed in Antioch, Perga, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra. But certain members of the Pharisees' party who had become believers objected. Differences of opinion were expressed. A quarrel was provoked by those same inflexible custodians of the law of Moses. A choice had to be made. On one hand, the Judeo-Christians were demanding that converted pagans submit to circumcision and observance of the law. On the other, Paul and his followers were offering evangelical freedom to everyone, indiscriminately in the name of Christ. At this point, Peter stepped in. He spoke of a choice made by God to give the Holy Spirit to the pagans as well. He stressed how there could be no distinction between them and us, because all hearts have been purified by faith.
Peter's speech in Jerusalem can be read as a gesture of great mediation, but it's also one of great innovation insofar as it opens up the gospel to the people, to the whole world. Circumcision is no longer necessary for those who want to become a Christian. Only baptism and belief in Jesus Christ. Peter played an important role of reconciling differences, but the speech also marked a turning point, the first major turning point in the history of Christianity.
In Jerusalem, the quarter that extends from the Damascus Gate to the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre and to the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a buzz of people. The spilled blood of a lamb or a goat fills the air with a pungent odor. You must not eat flesh with life, that is to say, with blood in it. You may slaughter and eat flesh, only you must not consume the blood. Orthodox Jews can repeat the scriptural decrees by heart. Peter was saying, risk dividing the assembly in two. The silence among the delegates could have been cut with a knife. James, head of the first community in Jerusalem, was there representing the elders. He realized it was time to mediate. He proposed adding a few subclauses: abstinence from blood, prohibition against eating the meat of animals sacrificed to idols or of strangled animals, the condemnation of immodest acts. If these rules were to be accepted, they would guarantee a more convivial atmosphere among the mixed Christian communities. Paul accepted them. The important thing for him was to legitimate his role as apostle of the Gentiles. Peter would proclaim the gospel to the Jews, Paul to the pagans. In fact, he concludes, these people who are acknowledged leaders had nothing to add to the good news as I preach it. The journey back to Antioch was long and exhausting.
Karaman is an important city in Turkey, the capital of the province of Central Anatolia. The garden of the small museum lies in the heart of the historic center, a stone's throw away from the mosque. A few stone slabs recall something of the city at the time of Paul. Inside the museum are collections coming from the surrounding region. They tell the story of the city's most significant moments down the centuries. A display of human remains is especially striking. Perhaps he was a traveler who was attacked by robbers. Quite a common occurrence in Paul's time.
He wasn't a merchant or a military man. He certainly wasn't a nobleman. He couldn't afford to stay at an inn overnight. He traveled the great Roman highways and some rough byways too, on foot and mostly alone. Sometimes he called himself a preacher, other times a prophet or a witness of the most varied beliefs. A man of no fixed abode, who went from place to place with his staff and his haversack. He lived in poverty, and without country or family or home, existing on the margins of society, outside all the official structure of the time. This was the kind of man Paul would have been identified with. An unusual weariness had overcome Paul of late. He felt lonely sometimes. Barnabas was no longer with him. He missed his quiet companionship, even if Silas, a new collaborator who was traveling with him for the first time, was a patient and attentive man. There was in Antioch of Syria before they left. Barnabas had suggested that Paul take John Mark along with him. Paul had refused. Barnabas remembered the experience at Perga in Pamphylia, when John Mark had to face the trial of their apostolic journey alone, and decided not to insist. Maybe it was time they separated. Barnabas set sail for Cyprus. Paul set out on foot for Antioch of Syria to visit the established communities there. Paul and Silas head north. Following the Roman road that runs straight through the Orontes River valley.
First spurs of the Taurus Mountains appeared in the distance, and then gates of Cilicia, obligatory passage for Greeks, Persians, Macedonians, Greeks, and Romans. In Lystra, they were joined by Timothy, a young man Paul met 3 years earlier. Even then, despite his age, he had tried to convince Paul and Barnabas to take him with them. Paul, Silas, and Timothy moved further inland, heading east as far as the border with Phrygia and the region of the Galatians.
Then the unexpected happened. An illness, a thorn in the flesh, something that provoked passion and contempt. We're not told much more than that. Experts of every era have offered their own various and often bizarre interpretations. The thorn in the flesh has been explained as continued opposition by the Jews. Alternatively, as a physical malady like malaria, and deafness. The list of pathologies is endless. Paul quite simply interprets his infirmity as a sign of God testing them. Henceforth, whenever he speaks of pain or suffering, he means it in a very concrete, physical sense.
Luke concludes his account thus. They thought to cross into Bithynia, but since the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them, they went straight through Mysia and came down to Troas. Troas is a mountain region flanked by the sea on 3 sides and stretching as far as the furthest northwest corner of the Asian province. The name conjures up memories of Homer, the walls of Troy, and the epic saga involving Greeks and Trojans that took place over 3,000 years ago. Less than 20 kilometers from Troy, following the road that cuts inland, lie the remains of another settlement. The remains of Alexandria Troas, an Aegean port city that in Paul's time was particularly prosperous. From this port, vessels departed for Macedonia, Greece, and Italy. At this point, the author of the Acts of the Apostles surprises us. Luke's chronicled account suddenly becomes a personal one. We lost no time in arranging a passage to Macedonia. From now on, he involves himself directly in the action. A summer's day in the year 50 AD. A balmy breeze filled the sails. First stop, Samothrace, then on to Neapolis, present-day Kavala, less than 2 days sailing in all. Paul set foot on European soil for the first time. The city of Neapolis clusters around the harbor where the ships tie up, then fans out slightly into the surrounding countryside. Paul had no difficulty finding the road, a secondary offshoot of the Egnatian Way that would take him to Philippi, just a few kilometers away, less than 15 to be exact. The towers of Philippi, one of the principal cities of Macedonia, quickly appeared on the horizon.
The city of Philippi, as we see it today, is a vast archaeological area filled with monuments and ruins. Philippi was founded by Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, and has left us many examples of its past glories, like a marble-paved forum, for example, a library, 2 fountains, a theatre. Around the middle of the 4th century, 3 imposing basilicas were built with their own baptistry, and important traces of these can be seen as well.
There was no synagogue in the city, so the meeting took place along the river outside the gates. Perhaps the river was the Gangites, which still runs a couple of kilometers outside the city. It was the Sabbath, and a group of women came to the meeting. Paul sat down and addressed them. But the location and the listeners were unusual. The men were conspicuous by their absence. Women only, a group of second-class citizens. The church isn't very old. It's dedicated to Lydia, a woman from Thyatira, a city in Asia Minor that was famous for its dyes. Lydia was at the meeting that day listening to Paul. She was in the purple dye trade and was clearly her own boss, as she seems to have taken orders from no one, a rare kind of woman for her era. That Sabbath day was to change Lydia's life. Paul's words both convinced and converted her, and she was baptized. If you really think me a true believer in the Lord, come and stay with us. Her invitation was forthright, even disarming. The home of a wealthy woman was to become the meeting place of the first local community, a small domestic church. It was no small thing at the time for a woman to make that kind of invitation to a group of perfect strangers. It was revolutionary. Moreover, remarks Luke, she would take no refusal. Steel bars block the doorway. The room is tiny, empty, and ugly. Tradition says this is where Paul was imprisoned. This is where strange and dramatic events took place. A deafening roar in the middle of the night, an earthquake that shook the prison to its foundations. A few seconds of terror, followed by a long, deathly silence. At daybreak, a light breeze blew dust over the shattered buildings. There had been great fear and trembling in the prison that night. Paul and Silas had been singing God's praises when they were interrupted by a terrible noise, and saw the doors fly open and the chains fall from the prisoners. The jailer had calmed down by now. Paul and the other prisoners hadn't even tried to escape. A moment ago, freed from their shackles, those prisoners had posed such a serious problem as to drive him to attempt suicide. Now, through Paul, they were comforting and consoling him. Lantern light illuminated Paul's wounds. The jailer himself, assisted perhaps by some compassionate woman, washed and dressed them. The terror of what had happened gave way to the knowledge that true salvation, the salvation that permeates the whole of existence, is to be found beyond the confines of a prison. The jailer and his family were baptized immediately, then and there in the middle of the night. And despite what had happened, despite the incredible chain of events and the late hour, he took them home for a meal, while the whole family celebrated their conversion to belief in God. Now Paul had time to think back over the events that had led up to that moment.
Comme il existe ici
There was the street that led to the place of prayer. There was the young slave girl who made a lot of money for her masters by telling fortunes, and who insisted on following them around. There was the irritation caused by her constant shouting, which grew louder and more insistent every day. And finally, Paul's own order to the spirit to come out of the girl. Then the reaction of the young soothsayer's masters, their rage at losing so much money, the summary charges before the magistrates, and the prison cell. And then that wind, that roaring, shattering sound, and the broken chains. The magistrates have sent an order for your release. You can go now and be on your way. Hastening through the deserted city, officers brought the message as fast as they could. They were worried about what had happened. The earthquake, the freeing of the prisoners, the conversion of the jailer, these were events that could create nasty precedents. Better to release the ringleader on the quiet. Close the case as quickly as it had been opened. Paul had other ideas. They flog Roman citizens in public and without trial. They must come and escort us out themselves. When they heard they were Roman citizens, the magistrates came, apologized, and begged them to leave the city. Paul and his companions had just enough time for a last meeting with the brothers at Lydia's house. A few final words of encouragement, and then, concludes Luke, they left.
Tourists pose in front of the gate for a quick photograph. The guardian has already closed the entrance to the prison. Paul's prison, he reminds them enthusiastically, the real thing. It's probably never crossed his mind that it was here, in the city of Philippi, the little Rome of Macedonia, around 2,000 years ago, that Paul established the first European church.
Okay, one day. Okay. Okay. Togo. Okay, fine.
You talk to me in case of the price there.
Yeah. Okay, you didn't know.
Gospel.
Gospel. Sipko. Yeah, gospel, adoration. So, clip vidéo, ça dépend. Je suis sûr de l'artiste, par exemple, clip vidéo, là, ok. 1 million. Là, ok. Non, je sais, bien, mon pot là, mais clip, à partir de chez moi, c'est à partir de 100 000. C'est énorme, clip vidéo, ça dépend de l'artiste qui coordonne. Donc, il y a un message à faire pour le son. Dans ces moments-là. Ça dépend. C'est l'argent. Une fille qui est mise dans une chose. Donc, la vie va donc, pour le caméra, pour commencer le clip, caméra, cadre, je pense que c'est nous qui nous va déplacement,
Adoration, par exemple, musique, audio,
donc adoration, on a le studio qui est sur place.
Ah oui, sur place. Et parce que qui vidéo mais pas de déplacement là.
Gospel.
On va commencer comment on peut dire par la bonne avoir
Oh, les gars, on parle gospel est relatif parce que les hip-hop simple. Gospel.
Dans la vidéo, comment on a des dieux complets à nous. Vidéo, on a des dieux au moins.
Parce qu'il y a un film qui va dire c'est son. Après, la musique,
est-ce que les mains soient les d'abord, mais pour moi, on a eu l'améliorer, on peut l'améliorer.
Studio. Mateva.
on que au moins au moins soit maintenant les prêts au moins dit au moins il a pas que veiller alors amélioration pour l'améliorer
elle va si tu as une autre les prêts parce que amélioration c'est des gens est-ce que pour là à ta prochaine améliorer pour quitter les carrés pour sans de promotion et voilà améliorer le carré pour fitness sérieux soin dans les biens aussi comme soin les biens yo lancer promotion porter va na we fili wa no gado ni encore aussi comme mais non on est pas la go bien ado la semaine que on l'a dit image que promotion on l'a dit sur aussi comme quem vai ver não vale o vai ter lá no Vasco lá no ele cai cá o pó o cara ele dá para poder lá no cima lá ele vai pôr na mesa do aquilo com ela é rádio o som do no ele quando na função aí rádio podia função à internet com a imagem da linha que vai pôr quem vai ver o leite cheio quem você como quem vai ver o valor lá no preparar agora gospel é meio album chap essa nem gosto é de mensagem a não for très rare
on permet à Guyane. Donc, il faut qu'on s'en amène.
Ok.
Je sais du temps, on commence à en amener. De toute façon, c'est le béni.
On va nous pas 25 années.
Dieu là, on dit quoi?
Dieu est là, non. Dieu a bien le sept. On est sur place, les enfants. Là, on mange bien. On va dire qu'on va les conserver. Fati le bocadillo. Là, on clip dans les saints.
On peut évangéliser.
Ok, acho numéro ada.